All right, we are live. This is Event Horizon. This is my first YouTube live stream, everybody, and I'm excited to welcome on Matt Forney as my guest. It's kind of an honor to have him as my first guest, being the big shot YouTuber that he is. But thanks for coming on, Matt.
Yeah, thanks for having me on Event Horizon. It's the topic of the show is something I don't usually get to talk about, so that's part of what piqued my interest.
Yeah. So maybe do you want to talk a little bit about the conversation I guess we were having in the Cotto Godfrey chat, and maybe sort of the genesis of this conversation, and then we can sort of issues a little bit. Basically,
the mass infiltration into evangelicalism by the left. You were, before you went on air, you were giving me some details that were kind of explain, kind of fill that out. But the Southern Baptist Convention and a lot of evangelical churches have just been taken over by this liberation theology type BLM. Total subversion.
We'll go into some of the details in the history. I guess I'll just probably go through a little bit of the background, my religious background, and sort of how I found out about these subjects. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church. As I told you, I knew the founder of Chick-fil-A. I grew up sort of, deep in the heart of Dixie, as they say. It's Protestant evangelical country down in this part of the country. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Pentecostals, all the stripes of evangelicalism. I think there was one Catholic church in my entire county.
So it says Bible Belt as Bible Belt gets.
It's as Bible Belt as Bible Belt can be. I mean, Gone with the Wind and sweet tea and fried chicken, along with the King James Bible. And, we have pastors. We don't have priests down in this part of the country. And so that's kind of the religious background that I grew up in. I've had some experiences, I guess, in life that sort of, it prepared me for the woke moment and the issues that are involved. About 9 years ago when I was an undergrad, I actually developed a very fruitful friendship with a friend of mine who, because it was in a major city, it was a more diverse, student population than the state as a whole. He actually later ended up entering seminary, a Roman Catholic seminary, to go into the Catholic priesthood. And I know you've heard Tom talk about being sort of a Calvinistic or Reformed leaning Baptist, and believing in the doctrines of grace and sovereign grace and the sort of general Reformed tradition. And that relationship I had with my Roman Catholic friend, we're still deep friends. He is coming to my wedding. That really sort of, crystallized and made me start following guys like you'll hear these names come up: Douglas Wilson and James White, who are well-known Reformed apologists. I really began to have to ask the question, if the Catholic Church came before us as Protestants, then why am I a Protestant? And I found that the only consistent and I think biblical and historic apologetic for Protestants against Roman Catholics comes in the Reformed tradition, the Calvinistic tradition. That it was not an overthrow of the Catholic Church that the Reformers were trying to engage in, but trying to call the Catholic Church back to its roots. Unfortunately, there was a split, and we can do another stream at some point about Protestant Catholic issues. But that sort of opened my eyes to a whole other host of issues. I had a Jehovah's Witness neighbor, and ended up learning more than I would care to know about the Watchtower Society, which, just as a quick aside, about the least racist people you will meet in our society are Jehovah's Witnesses.
Oh yeah, I mean, I remember years ago on the Daily Show. I think it was Larry Wilcox or Wilmore. I forget his name. His joke was that Jehovah's Witnesses is Scientology for black people.
Yeah, it was funny. There was maybe a little bit of racial prejudice in their very beginning. If you look into the origins of the Watchtower Society and Charles Taze Russell's personal beliefs, but by the time they really got going in the early 1900s, I mean, they were for desegregation. And there's a guy in one of the videos that John Harris, Conversations That Matter, which he's a YouTube channel. I sent you some of his links. He's been foremost in my mind, and I'll continue to point you to his work, Matt, because he is the leading edge within the sort of anti-woke, evangelical movement right now, particularly as it pertains to the Southern Baptist Convention, fighting back against the woke movement. But he was interviewing a guy named Seth Richardson on his channel, who grew up, I guess was converted to the Watchtower Society and became a Jehovah's Witness. And it's a sad story that Seth has, where here was a guy who, he's sort of a country bumpkin kind of guy who grew up in North Carolina. And, he was brought into the Watchtower Society, was in a Kingdom Hall. I think he said he was maybe one of 4 white families in the entire Kingdom Hall. And he said they never felt any racial prejudice or animosity or anything like that. They were all, I guess the Jehovah's Witnesses have been so persecuted. And even though I think their beliefs are just off the wall, and that's another stream we can do at some point, they really are, great about, integration and not having racial prejudice, and sort of what you would expect the Christian church to look like. They're all Jehovah's people in their mind, and it doesn't matter whether they're black or Hispanic or Asian or white. They are all part of, they all consider themselves one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and they certainly have a lot of skeletons in their closet. But John interviewed him, and it was just sad because here was a guy who was coming out of a cult movement, and he entered what we would consider a solid Bible-believing evangelical Southern Baptist church. And, within a few months to a year, he's on fire for the Lord. He's, come to believe the gospel, he's reading his Bible, plugged in with the church, and he's out there doing street evangelism. And the church has recommended resources by a guy named D.A. Horton, who is associated with Dhati Lewis. These are 2 names, sort of the 2 leading guys within sort of the woke wing of the Southern Baptist Convention. Dhati Lewis is a pastor down in Atlanta, Georgia, and D.A. Horton was one of his church members. And these are guys who came up with terms like thebonics, like, theology and ebonics, sort of a crass and unfortunate portmanteau. But, he was talking about, when you go and talk to, young black men on the street, when you're witnessing them or evangelizing them, you don't confront them as, historically Christians would do, of like, hey, like the Way of the Master, Kirk Cameron, Ray Comfort, where they would, ask people, it's like, if you ever told a lie, would you consider yourself a good person? And then, once they confront somebody with their sin, then they launch into the good news. Well, yes, we're all sinners, but this is what Jesus has done for us. Would you like to give your life to Jesus? That's not what was being taught at this church. What was being taught is, you go up to a young black man in the inner city and you say, what do you think about how the police are, treating the black community in the area? What do you think about systemic injustice? What do you think about racial reconciliation? And we can go into, sort of the history a little bit more here, but that's essentially the story that happened with Seth. And he spoke out, had an argument with his pastor, and turns out, that church's efforts to reach out to the sort of inner city urban community that they were surrounded by didn't really produce much fruit in that effort, because it wasn't based on something that's true, and it's not based on either the Bible or, sort of historic confessional, Protestant beliefs. And so just to sort of round it back to my story, I ended up moving to my current location, which is near a Southern Baptist seminary, about 2 years ago for work. And, I ended up in a similar church context. And let's just say that January of 2019, things were going well. I was really enjoying the church context I was in. It seemed like it was a solid, even Reformed leaning Southern Baptist church. And then I called up, I found one of the YouTube videos I sent you from John Harris, where he talks about the downgrade of a particular Southern Baptist seminary. He basically just for an hour and a half talked about the fact that critical theory, intersectionality, liberalism was being taught in this seminary. He mentions a really interesting little story where I guess when he was there initially in 2014, there was a maintenance worker on the campus. And this is in the South, where he's in seminary at. And there's a maintenance worker who had an old beat up pickup truck, and on his tailgate or his bumper, he had a little Confederate flag decal. And, he said he talked to this guy and he was just the nicest guy in the world. And, John is a guy with mixed Northern and Southern heritage. I think he's actually up from your neck of the woods originally, a place called Wappinger Falls, New York.
Where?
It's a place called Wappinger Falls, New York. I guess it's
the name rings a bell. Yeah, but I couldn't place it.
It's up in upstate New York. He's a preacher's kid. And, he ended up at a Southern Baptist seminary because he thought, hey, the Southern Baptists are the most solid, rock-ribbed, conservative Bible-believing denomination. And so their seminaries must be the same way. And so that was his original experience. So he ended up down at that particular seminary in 2014, saw this guy with Confederate flag decal. Nobody made a stink about it. It was just sort of, whatever. I think he had to take some time off about 2 years or so, and he was doing online classes. And he didn't come back until I think early 2017 to the seminary, the physical seminary location. And he said when he got back, everything had changed. There was no more maintenance worker with a little Confederate flag decal. And I think he had both an American flag and a Confederate flag decal on his bumper. And he said people were stopping on campus to look at it, and people were confronting him. Why would you have such a symbol of oppression? And he was like, what is going on? And he talked about when he was at church, hearing one of the pastors addressing the Michael Brown shooting. And, this before all the facts had come out, basically saying this is a problem with systemic racism and systemic injustice. And, the police have, that they targeted this guy, and this kid was, that an injustice had occurred. And, John just began to, do some more research and push back against this. And he ended up, I guess, in a different place. I actually think he's at Liberty now. This is all public domain, so, not breaking his privacy or anything, which is funny as a Reformed Calvinist guy, for him to end up at Liberty, which is, I'm not sure how familiar you are with sort of intra-Protestant controversies. The Calvinism-Arminianism divide is a big one as it relates to the nature of grace. And Calvinists are, sort of Presbyterians, Anglicans. We believe in the 5 points of Calvinism, sovereign grace, that kind of stuff. Whereas Arminians are more of your Stephen Anderson, type.
Yeah. The Arminians, they believe in free will and all that.
Yeah, exactly. Have you made your decision for Jesus and that kind of stuff? That sort of revivalistic, Charles Finney would be sort of, a classic American example of an Arminian preacher, which is strange. Like when I reached out to John to talk about his experience, if you'd asked me 5 years ago what issue was going to be the issue that, ruptured the Southern Baptist Convention, I think me, along with 95% of other people, would have said, it would have been the Calvinism-Arminianism divide. I'd say the SBC is, sort of evenly divided between people who are Calvinistic and Arminian in terms of their theology. But, that now just seems like such a distant issue, such a small issue compared to the woke moment that we're dealing with. Sort of the genesis of this, I'll give you a background to the Southern Baptist Convention, the state of the convention, something called the conservative resurgence, and then sort of where we find ourselves out now, and maybe what the reasons for the woke moment were. And for those of you guys out there who think this is sort of an esoteric topic, it's like, just remember, the Southern Baptist Convention is the nation's largest Protestant denomination, and also nominally the nation's largest conservative denomination as well. If we want to exclude the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, since they don't, not sure we would consider Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy within the quote unquote denominational paradigm. But the Southern Baptist Convention was founded in 1845, leading up to the Civil War. There were differences between the Northern Baptists and the Southern Baptists at that time. John has some great materials on this. What is taught today in the seminaries is that the SBC sort of split from the Northern Baptist over the issue of slavery, and that it was purely, the SBC was founded on this evil, racist, foundation, which if you go back and read the primary source, that is not at all the case. Yes, the issue of slavery was an issue, whether or not missionaries could take their slaves onto the mission field. And this actually comes back to a deeper issue that we can talk about later, as far as whether slavery is intrinsically sinful or not. I think that's an important question that Christians have to answer, since the terminology of the master-slave relationship is throughout not only the Old Testament under the Mosaic Law and the Old Testament covenant, but also is extensively utilized in the New Testament, both within Jesus's teachings in the Gospels, as well as in the writings of the apostles in the New Testament epistles. So it's an issue that needs to be dealt with. We don't have enough time tonight, I think, to go into all the issues of the antebellum South and the slave trade in, the United States from its founding, from before the founding to the lead up to the Civil War. But that was one of the issues. There were other issues related to theological liberalism. In the 1830s, 1840s, you began to see the development of higher criticism and sort of unbelieving liberal theology coming out of the Tübingen school in Germany. And this spread like wildfire throughout Western Europe and even into the more cosmopolitan areas of the northern United States in particular. And so theological liberalism, people who say, well, Moses didn't really write the first 5 books of Moses, and maybe the Bible's not exactly infallible, and, maybe John didn't really write the Gospel of John, it's sort of somebody in that tradition. And so the inheritors of that tradition, the woke movement, I would consider as a part of the greater theological liberal movement within Protestantism. And before I move forward, I just want to say real quick, for you trad Catholic and trad Orthodox guys who want to criticize Protestants, theological liberalism is coming for you. If you look at the state of the papacy right now and the theological positions of Pope Francis, and even what is happening in the Greek Orthodox Church here in the United States, there was a Greek Orthodox hierarch who ended up at a Black Lives Matter, rally. So if you think that, because you have the church and you think you have tradition and history, that you're somehow immune from theological liberalism, you have no further than to look at the Pope and your own hierarchs.
It's already everywhere. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the big issues in this part of the world, I'm in Albania right now. One of the big issues recently was that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church split from the Patriarch of Constantinople allowed them to form their own, I forget what the term is, Metropolitan Patriarchate. They separated from the Moscow branch. And one of the first things the new Patriarch of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church said was, we need to change our stance on gays. Like, that was one of the first things he did.
Yeah. I think that that is it's coming. It's everywhere. And I have an Eastern Orthodox colleague who I've talked about some of these issues, and he sort of told me, I think, sort of naively, he's like, "Oh no, well, this could never happen in the Orthodox Church," and I just sort of had to stifle a pained smile, like, "I'm sorry, my friend, but it's coming for you guys as well." It's like, I'm sorry, but Protestant liberalism has infected every corner of Christendom, and if it can affect the Southern Baptist Convention, it can even affect your traditionalist Catholics and your traditionalist Orthodox. And so, you guys need to be preparing now. What is your answer going to be? What is your response going to be when these issues come to your doorstep? Because if you're not prepared, you risk losing everything. And this movement will cost the church everything if it's not stopped. I think this may be a little bit of an overstatement, but, just to lay my cards on the table, I think the liberal moment and theological liberalism, with the woke moment being its leading edge, could end up being, in hindsight, the greatest theological controversy in the history of Christianity. Bigger than the Arian controversy, bigger than the Great Schism, bigger than the Reformation. The liberal moment and what liberal theology has done in the postmodern West has so corrupted and so distorted the historic biblical foundations of the church's teaching that it has left no stone unturned, and that it is going to affect every single congregation of every single denomination. And so you guys need to be preparing now for what response you're going to give. We see what's happening in the culture right now. And that pressure that is in the culture is only going to grow greater upon the church. And so back to the sort of history of the SBC, Matt, and just sort of where these issues arose from. So even back in the 1840s, they were already dealing with issues of liberalism. The Northern Baptists were not as sound theologically as the Southern Baptists were on issues such as biblical inerrancy, the faithful sort of textual reading, an originalist reading, if we want to use language of, like judges reading the Constitution. That sort of same idea for how we are to read the Bible. We're to read it literally, historically, grammatically. What was the original author's intent? Who is the original audience? And then drawing application from what the text says, as opposed to reading into what we want to say or what we want to see in the text. And so that was a big issue. Over the next 70 to 80 years, particularly after the Civil War, this divide began to grow even further. I think you began to see, I think it's the 1930s through like the 1960s, the beginning of, some of those Northern Baptist churches allowing the ordination of women, their seminaries, departing from historic confessional Protestantism on the nature of, issues like contraception, sex outside of marriage, just a number of issues in relation to that, the inerrancy of Scripture. However, these issues began to seep into the Southern Baptist Convention. sort of movement known as the social gospel. Norman Vincent Peale and I think it was Rauschenbusch was the other guy. I may be mixing that up, but there were theologians, primarily American theologians, who were promoting this sort of health and wealth. Some of the prosperity gospel sort of comes out of that social gospel sort of preaching, where it was less a focus on, you're a sinner who's going to die one day and stand before a holy God, and how can you be made right before God, to, well, how can you have your best life now, as one famous Houston, pastor of a mega church likes to say. So the Southern Baptist Convention, by the time of the 1970s, was on shaky footing. The seminaries had gone way left, weren't believing in inerrancy. All the sort of liberal, people weren't believing in the virgin birth, the deity of Christ, the physical bodily resurrection, these historic, basic, foundational Christian teachings. So there was a clandestine meeting. Paige Patterson was at the forefront of that, actually in Café du Monde in New Orleans, I think in 1980. It may have been a couple years before, where you had a few conservative men. I think Paige Patterson was either the head of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary or Southwestern Seminary at the time. I think he was at Southeastern at that time and later ended up at Southwestern Seminary. He got a couple of men together who were like, okay, here's what we believe. This is what our historic confessions say. This is what the Bible teaches on these issues. We have to take the denomination back. And what is unique about the Southern Baptist Convention, and why I think the Southern Baptist Convention was able to come back from the brink initially, is unlike the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church, especially you look at the Episcopal Church or the mainline Protestant churches, the United Church of Christ, of which Jeremiah Wright was a member, that because they had more of a top-down Episcopal structure where they had bishops or they had, sort of a denominational control from the top down upon the local churches, that the local congregations really couldn't do anything about what was being done at the top. The thing about Baptist polity that's actually, it's imperfect, but I think is an advantage in this situation. And there's biblical arguments for this. The structure of the church has not always been an Episcopal form of church government where you had bishops and archbishops and, they were sort of controlling, beyond the level of the local church. But the Southern Baptist Convention is not so much a denomination as it is a convention. Some people like to say colloquially that the Southern Baptist Convention only exists for 3 days a year when we actually have the convention.
It's fellowship, basically.
Yeah, it's a fellowship of 45 to 50,000 independent, autonomous local churches that have decided to network and fellowship with one another, to have a common confession of faith, to have what is called the cooperative program, where we all donate as individual congregations to that joint effort, and that's funds the entities, quote unquote, the entities being the 6 Southern Baptist seminaries, the North American Mission Board, which is our North American wing of sort of church planting and evangelistic efforts, the International Mission Board, which is outside of the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, the sort of international wing of church planting and missionaries. It's sort of our International Missionary Society. And then one entity that's sort of a policy, church-state relations entity called the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is currently headed by a man by the name of Dr. Russell Moore, who that name will come up again. I sent some, information and resources to you offline, but let's just say that Russell Moore is one of these shadowy figures in the background, who is pulling the strings, shall we say, in terms of the woke movement within the SBC. But that is essentially what the Southern Baptist Convention is. So what Patterson and those men who met at Café du Monde in New Orleans, their idea is it's like, okay, while the entities, the seminaries, the mission agencies, and the ERLC, they had gone way far to the left. However, through the cooperative program, they were still accountable to the local churches. And so the local churches, unlike in the Catholic Church or the Episcopal Church or the sort of top-down Episcopal structure, high liturgical churches, the entities, the people at the top, are accountable to the local congregations, to the local churches. And so theoretically, if you can get enough local churches who send their what are called messengers to the Southern Baptist Convention, to the annual convention, if you can get enough of them, you can start electing people on the executive committee. And if you get conservative people on the executive committee, they then appoint the people who are on all the other committees who are responsible for things like appointing seminary presidents, appointing entity heads, drafting resolutions, updating the confession, all those sorts of things. And so what they did is they sort of went at a grassroots level, and one by one, local churches were won over by the conservatives in the convention, and they actually took over the entire convention. It was a great thing. The people who were clearly not Orthodox Christians and who we would say are not Christian at all, who were in these positions, were one by one removed. To where all the seminaries were given conservative heads, all of the mission agencies and the ERLC were, populated by conservatives again, and the denomination came back from the brink of liberalism, and it was due to
it was a classic victory of American democracy and
yes,
know-how.
Yes, which American democracy, if you go back to it, it's not really democracy. It's a democratic republic. That if you go back to what the founders were drawing from, as far as, what was their inspiration for the Constitution. Yes, there were ideas in the Enlightenment. Yes, there were ideas in ancient Greece and Rome. And, they were very familiar with the classical world as well as Enlightenment thought. But their immediate context was their church constitutions, their church governments. And many of these men came from congregationalist backgrounds in the Northeast, or from more low church, more low church expressions of Anglicanism, where you have this more congregational form of church government. And so that was, it's deeply baked into the American psyche. And a lot of it comes from this sort of low church evangelical Protestant character of the majority of the founding population of the country. The Southern Baptist Convention actually was able to come back from the brink. And it's like, okay, well, we had this great conservative resurgence. Well, when did stuff start to go wrong again? One of the problems, because of the history of the convention, because of its association with the Civil War and the American South in particular, it's called the Southern Baptist Convention. There were a lot of these, I think, well-meaning and well-intentioned men who grew up in segregation, who saw the effects of Jim Crow as young men and women. Guys like, Albert Mohler, who's the president of the flagship seminary, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Other guys along his nature. I think even my own pastor growing up, who would have experienced that, who experienced integration, that there was a great sense of white guilt by the time we entered into the 1990s. The Reagan years were over, the sort of, end of the Cold War led to this great celebration, and, Americanism and Christianity and freedom had triumphed over the communist world. And, we entered this new age in the 1990s, and once the Soviet Union fell, all of a sudden America doesn't have any enemies anymore on the global stage, at least that can rival us. And so I think that really turned a lot of people inward. You had, in the Reagan years, Jerry Falwell, who at that time was part of the SBC. Later, I think Thomas Rhode disassociated himself from the SBC. So Liberty University, even though it's an evangelical university and they're essentially Baptists in their statement of faith, they're not affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention anymore. You had that sort of moral majority, cultural push where we were fighting against abortion and homosexuality and, all the evils and vices of sort of the postmodern, post-Cold War. It then later became the post-Cold War, American culture. And you began to have a lot more discussion in regards to the past of the denomination. Even on other issues, you had evangelicals and Catholics together signed in, I guess, 94 or 95 around the same time, where evangelicals were like, well, maybe our anti-Catholic past, we need to reach out to our conservative Catholic friends and neighbors. And so the Southern Baptist Convention apologized for slavery in the mid-90s. There was a resolution that was passed. I think it was at the 95 convention. And it was essentially asking for forgiveness for slavery. And, most people think, okay, it's done, it's over. I think that was sort of the spirit of the 90s. I'm not sure if you would agree with that, but I feel like the 90s was sort of like the last American decade.
It's increasingly feeling like that in retrospect.
Yeah, where, we were after the Cold War, it was before 9/11. People could sort of think about these things. We had a generation had passed since the civil rights movement. And so I think people wanted to sort of, maybe naively have this sort of feel-good, this sort of feel-good, reconciliation movement, for lack of a better term. I think that from that point forward, while the initial intent was a good intent, I think the way in which it was done has led to the situation we have today. Because there's a concept within Christianity, this, Matt, where people are responsible only for their own sins. That the sins of the Father shall not be passed to the sins of the Son, or shall not become the sins of the Son, and the sins of the Son shall not be charged to the Father. That people are ultimately responsible before God for their own sins. It doesn't mean that there can't be sinful or, destructive systems, but that you can't burden people who are not involved with a sinful system with the guilt that comes with that system. In a sense, it becomes a new form of, from our perspective, a new form of indulgence, a new form of penance, a new form of original sin. And that's where I ultimately think this heresy comes in, is that it denies the doctrine of original sin. I'm thoroughly Augustinian in my view of my anthropology and my view of man. I have a very pessimistic outlook on human nature, as all Catholics and Reformed Protestants should, given the impact that St. Augustine had on the development of Western theology. Maybe a little bit to the extreme at times, but I think in general he was correct on these issues. But you had sort of what became a structural form of Christianity that began denying the substance. I think during this time, you began to see things like the emergent church movement. Ed Stetzer, who's one of the editors of the Gospel Coalition, that's one of the organizations I pointed you to that's sort of leading this charge for wokeness within evangelicalism. He's a former emergent church guy, where you had a bunch of people who are coming out of this sort of rigid, Stephen Anderson-esque fundamentalism, who wanted like, well, maybe we can mix up the hymns and we need to have a contemporary form of worship. And instead of a choir, we should get a praise band. And, you had these things that in and of themselves are not bad, but they were done without much reflection. And so I think that's sort of the milieu that developed. And then there are two other events. I want to get your take on this, Matt, from a socio-political perspective, because I think you probably have a better take on this. I think there were two events in the 2000s, maybe three events, that sort of began to, because, Beckloff and, guys like that, Cotto, they talk about the breakdown of the religious right. What was the beginning of the breakdown of the religious right? I think there were three events. One was 9/11. I think the September 11th terrorist attack really brought the sort of external threat of Islam and Islamic fundamentalism back to the West's consciousness. If you look historically, even the slave trade itself was reintroduced into the Western world by Spain. And what was unique about Spain in the context of Western history, it's like, well, Spain was ruled by Muslim rulers for 800 years, and slavery is an integral part of Islamic society. You go to the Muslim world today, even in places where slavery is outlawed, like Pakistan or Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia or Somalia, even if slavery is outlawed de jure, de facto, it's still going on. And actually read an interesting article by quoting one of the head, religious scholars in the country of Mauritania, who is saying, you Westerners, who are trying to get us to give up our slaves, this goes against Islamic law, this goes against the Sharia, you need to compensate us. And, so the whole reintroduction of slavery into the Western world, because Constantine had outlawed it, was through the Islamic Caliphate and through the Islamic expansion. Many of the controversies that have arisen in church history and many of the divisions, I think more Christians need to realize just the impact that the external threat of Islamic expansion has had upon the Christian mind. From a theological perspective, the arguments of Islam against Christianity are facile compared to, say, the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Muslim argument against the Trinity is facile. It's coming from an ignorant position, whereas a Jehovah's Witness can argue you very sophisticatedly on their point. So it's not so much that Islam is a robust, intellectual or theological position, but it is a very robust cultural and civilizational perspective. They know what they believe and why they believe it, even if a lot of that is ignorance. So 9/11 was one. The Iraq War was the second one, where the Christian right seemed to line up behind George W. Bush like a bunch of crusaders wanting to go and fight, the next crusade against, the evil of Saddam Hussein, and we need to spread democracy to the Middle East. And, where it's like, well, the Christian population in Iraq was 10% of the entire population before the invasion. Now it's something like 1 to 2%. It's like, well, they worship different than us, so, they're not really Christians. And it's like, I think that's a rather naive perspective to have. And I think the third cultural issue was the election of Barack Obama. I think the election of Barack Obama really began to erode the cultural impact of the religious right. So I've been monologuing for a little bit, Matt. That's sort of the things I see leading up to the woke moment. Did you want to provide any commentary on those things, and then we can sort of talk about?
I think that's mostly accurate. I think the Iraq War, however, was the biggest thing that kind of hurt the religious right. With regards to Barack Obama, I mean, a shift to the Democrats was inevitable after the failure of the Iraq War and the collapse of the economy. I don't think 9/11 had that big an impact. If anything, it temporarily strengthened the religious right, at least for a short while. But the attachment many evangelical leaders had to the Iraq War, and by 2006, it was pretty clear to everyone that the war was an utter disaster. Yeah. I think discredited a lot evangelicalism to a lot of people. Discredited the religious right in general because they were tainted with it. You know, they were deeply associated with George W. Bush, and when he fell, they also fell. My understanding is that the motivation was like the clash of civilizations, and of course, support for Israel because Saddam Hussein is threatening Israel. You get some of that. That's also fueled like agita against Iran. Iran is threatening Israel. It also fuels agita against Russia because Russia is threatening Israel. I remember back in 2012, I did a hitchhiking trip across the country. I went from Syracuse, New York to Portland, Oregon. And I spent 2 months in the North Dakota oil fields because I was looking for work. I walked in there. I managed to hitchhike from this was in September of 2012. I managed to hitchhike from, I think it was, Bismarck, the capital, to Williston. And I was on the edge of the city, and I was just walking in, and a guy drives up to me, and he tells me that he and some of the parishioners from the local Baptist church were having a little social get-together, and he invited me because I was new in town. I was like, sure, I don't have anything better to do. And they were nice people. I ate there, and they decided to save me after asking some questions. We had a little ceremony. They were watching some evangelical TV channel, and they had a map of the Middle East, and I remember seeing Magog superimposed over Russia. So I can't speak to how deeply this is embedded now because this was so long ago, but the attachment to Israel and its manifestation in the Iraq War was, I think, probably the single biggest event. Like Barack Obama, at least initially, was recoverable. 9/11, I think, was recoverable. The Iraq War, however, was a pretty damaging blow.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think one of the problems with that, I just want to preface this, there's a lot of people on the dissident right and the alt-right who I think engage in, actual anti-Semitism and bigotry against Jews. I think that is a reprehensible position. However, at the same time, I think on the other side, coming from the religious right, the sort of dispensational John Hagee, sort of wing of evangelicalism that has this sort of blind support for the nation of Israel. It's first of all, it's unsustainable. And secondly, it's theologically untenable. I've had plenty of conversations with Jewish friends and Jewish colleagues of mine. And, whenever I talk with them about religion, I don't treat them any different than I would treat anyone else. They need the gospel and they need Jesus, just like, the starving child in Africa does. I think Israel is a functioning democracy that has a lot in common with the United States, and we can have a good, cordial relationship with Israel. But I think that the impact of Christian Zionism is something that needs to end. Dispensationalism, as you probably know, Matt, it's a novelty in church history. It came from the Schofield Bible in the late 1800s, and this sort of, secret rapture, all these timelines of the end times, people who had this overemphasis upon eschatology and the last days and reading, the book of Revelation and this very, mysterious, sort of, or those Apache helicopters that are being described, kind of thing. It's just like, that's not been the historic position of the church. Even those who were premillennial in their eschatology did not have this sort of like, well, there needs to be a rebirth of the physical nation of Israel, and this is fulfillment of Bible prophecy, and we're seeing the Bible, come alive today. It's like Ezekiel is, the front page of the New York Times with Israel going to war with, the Palestinians. And it's like that kind of theological position, I think, has just had such a corrosive, damaging, detrimental impact upon the church, and not only on it internally, but even on our witness. Because it divorces itself from biblical fidelity and from Christian history. And it's like, yeah, we can have a more, nuanced and, actual healthy relationship with Israel and the Jewish community than what is being pushed by John Hagee and that sort of dispensational wing of the Christian right. And there's a friend of mine who will probably be watching this at some point who is very dispensational in his beliefs. And it's like, sorry, my friend, but that's not, it's just not tenable. So yeah, I agree with you. So I think there was a lot of shame that came out of the support for the Iraq War from the Christian right. And I think the election of Barack Obama, that was more of a pivot back to domestic issues from the sort of jingoistic, adventuring for us to, let's go take out a dictator only to give the country into the hands of Islamic terrorists. I think that the election of Barack Obama pivoted the nation back to more domestic issues, which ultimately, given what we all know about Barack Obama today, I think was only inevitable to sort of throwing fertilizer on the soil that has led to the woke movement within the church. How familiar are you, Matt, with Barack Obama's background, religiously speaking?
I've got the broad strokes. I know he was involved with, there was Jeremiah Wright and the United Church of Christ, Church of God, that type United of theology.
Yeah, the UCC.
But I don't think he was very terribly involved in it, because as far as I recall, he did end up leaving that church, or he just stopped attending church services. And so far as I know, for the rest of his presidency, he didn't acknowledge going to church at all.
Yeah, I think he had a private chaplain or something like that who ministered to him. But the fact that he was in that church for 20 to 30 years of his life, that pastor was the man who baptized his children and married he and his wife. I think Jeremiah Wright married him and his wife. Maybe wrong on that. I know he baptized their kids. The UCC is one of those apostate mainline denominations. Think about, lesbian priests in the Episcopal Church, flying rainbow flags outside the church. That is the UCC. And that sort of theology goes all the way back to what we were talking about before about theological liberalism, and when it entered the United States, particularly in the early 1900s. The United Church of Christ was one of these mainline denominations that was one of the first to apostatize, one of the first to give up on the inerrancy of Scripture, on the importance of the historical grammatical interpretation of Scripture, really moving to the left on cultural issues. There's a seminary called Union Theological Seminary, which is actually where Jeremiah Wright, I think, did his doctoral work. I think he was at Princeton beforehand.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Union. They're very they're a bastion of liberal Protestant theology. Another notable graduate they have is Pastor James Manning.
Yeah. James Manning. Let's see. Is he the black pastor who? Yeah.
He's the one in Harlem who rails against gays.
Yeah, which is interesting. So this actually will tie in very nicely with what we're talking about, because it actually is deeply connected. One of Jeremiah Wright's mentors at Union Theological Seminary was a man by the name of James Cone. I'm not sure how familiar you are with his name.
It rings a distant bell.
So James Cone was the founder of liberation theology in the U.S., in particular Black liberation theology. He wrote a formative book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree back in the 60s or 70s, something like that. If you go and listen to James Cone, he's the guy, it's like, where did Jeremiah Wright, get all these, sayings like GD America, America's chickens coming home to roost. Jesus was a poor Black man living in a rich white country. The Romans were white. Jesus was, the oppressed minority. That came from James Cone. One of the problems, and I think this is a real issue from the SBC's history and where a lot of the guilt comes in, Vodi Balcom, who he's a Black guy, but very, very solid pastor. You can look up his works on YouTube. He talks about, because of Jim Crow, which was state-mandated segregation, you had a lot of pastors, Black pastors from Black churches in the South. They did not receive their education in more theologically conservative seminaries. This is actually Martin Luther King, who, oddly enough, Martin Luther King also went to Union Theological Seminary, if you did not know that. I think he
doesn't surprise me.
He was a contemporary of James Cone. He may have been a little bit before. I think James Cone was sort of younger when Martin Luther King had already gone through. But you had a lot of Black pastors. It's like, why is there so much crazy theology in the predominantly Black church? You think about men like T.D. Jakes or Creflo Dollar, or the prosperity gospel preachers who are out there, or even guys like Jeremiah Wright on the more liberal end. It's because they all went to these more liberal, non-Bible believing, non-conservative seminaries, because they weren't allowed to attend many of the conservative seminaries, Baptist and Presbyterian seminaries that were in the South. And so guys like MLK ended up at Union Theological Seminary, where he was learning theology from white liberal, seminary professors who had long since apostatized from the historic Christian faith on issues such as the virgin birth, the Trinity, the divine nature of the scriptures, all that sort of stuff. So James Cone was the founder of Black liberation theology in the United States. And he drew heavily upon, sort of Catholic liberation theology that had sort of preceded him by a couple of decades. And this stuff was swirling around in these, liberal, northern seminaries. And his protege was Jeremiah Wright. And so when you listen to Jeremiah Wright's sermons, that's just full of, for lack of a better term, anti-white vitriol, just hatred of white people, hatred of European culture, hatred of historic European Christianity. That's where this perspective is coming from. And so Cone, what he tried to do is he took, essentially, you have the Frankfurt School and the neo-Marxists. They were impacting the theology in the seminaries. He was drawing from neo-Marxist categories where instead of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, you had the oppressed and the oppressors. It went from being a class issue to being more of a race or a socio-cultural, paradigm. And so you just replaced, the bourgeoisie with sort of white, heteronormative Christian culture. Intersectionality plays into this as well. And you replace, the proletariat with sort of the put on, African American community that's living in the South under Jim Crow. And there's been all sorts of extensions and, developments and, different schools of thought that have arisen from this since then. But that was the sort of genesis of this theology. And so even though Barack Obama left that church, if you look at the way he handled things like the Trayvon Martin situation or the Michael Brown situation or Freddie Gray, or most of these things, oddly enough, came in his second term after he had defeated Romney. Then he could do whatever he wanted. And that's when you really saw the explosion of this on the cultural scene. I don't think he could have gotten away with this kind of divisive rhetoric 15 years ago, or 10 years ago, if he tried to pull a lot of this stuff during his first term. But it's once he secured re-election, all of this stuff began to come to the forefront. And that's around the same time that my friend John, was going into the seminary at Southeastern. And so there had been a lot of discussion of these social issues in Southern Baptist seminaries. I think it's that hangover from the Iraq War, that hangover from the Bush years, as well as the, dominant cultural perspective. There were a lot of Southern Baptist, thinkers and, Presbyterian Church in America, higher ups who were like, well, we wouldn't have voted for Barack Obama, or we didn't vote for Barack Obama because of abortion and that kind of stuff. But isn't it such a great thing that we finally elected a black man? Doesn't that prove how not racist we are, Matt? That was the kind of thinking that was going on.
Yeah.
You had this younger generation of evangelical, men like J.D. Greer, who is the current president of the convention, who, sort of this hip, blue jeans wearing, collared shirt, but not exactly a dress shirt with no tie. He has a little microphone and, he's preaching from the video screen, the multi-campus church model, that's what the young people want. Like that sort of began to, arise. And then you hit that sort of, pop, preacher, celebrity preacher, model of Christianity with all the social issues that began to arise. I think it just led to this dangerous stew of, issues that began to pile on top of one another, that led to the formation of woke Christianity that really announced itself in 2018 at the MLK 50 conference. It's not that there weren't rumblings of this beforehand, but MLK 50 was sort of, that was the announcement. That was the moment that sort of launched the controversy that we see today, which we can discuss more of that if you want to. I don't really see much in the way of chats at this point. It's my first live stream, so not expecting.
They will come. They will come eventually.
But maybe this is a point where if you want to ask me some specific questions about, like, what was MLK 50, who is J.D. Greer, what is Russell Moore, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, coronavirus, like how that plays into all this. I figure that might be the best way to take the show at this point.
I'm a bit interested in Russell Moore because you didn't really elaborate too much on him. I know the name, but I don't know much about him.
So I guess one of the elephants in the room that I left out is the impact that the Trump election had upon this conversation. Needless to say, Donald Trump is not let's just say the man is not a paragon of Christian virtue in terms of his personal life and his history.
Yeah.
A casino owner, real estate investor, man who's had 3 wives. He was sort of the anti-Barack Obama. If anything, Barack Obama had the social mores of a white liberal from the Hamptons who just so happened to be black, and he used that to his political advantage. And so he would talk about, all the issues of social justice and that kind of stuff. And honestly, I think that's one of the things that led to the Trump election, is you had the vast majority of evangelicals, 81% of whom voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 election, 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. Black evangelicals, which, maybe this will get me in trouble on YouTube. I'm starting to question if there is even such a thing as a black evangelical movement. most of the black churches, from my opinion, are apostate. They're heretical. I don't see much in the way of a biblically faithful black church in America. There are individual churches and individual pastors. Vody Balcom was a guy I mentioned earlier. Guys who are affiliated with John MacArthur, which I'll sort of draw the battle lines at some point. But yeah, they, I think a lot of white evangelicals saw what had happened under Barack Obama. They saw the Obergefell versus Hodges decision. They saw the appointment of liberal Supreme Court justices. They saw the acceleration of abortion in the culture. And really the changing of America from a center-right, predominantly white European Christian country into a multicultural center-left country. And I think a lot of them went to Donald Trump because even though he was not Christian the way that somebody like a Marco Rubio or a Ted Cruz or a Mike Huckabee or somebody like that was, Donald Trump spoke to the American people and particularly to American evangelicals in a way that was honest, in a way that was, straightforward. He's been wishy-washy on some. I mean, he's had sort of a mixed. I think most evangelicals would probably give him about a B in terms of his presidency. There's been some good and some bad. He's done more than we thought he would in certain areas and not as much in other areas. But I think that's honestly the reason a lot of white evangelicals voted for him is because they saw the just careening out of control of the culture under Barack Obama. And so they instinctively were like, look, we can't have any more liberal Supreme Court justices. We can't have, more state-sanctioned, state-celebrated rainbow flags, being lifted over the White House and the White House being lit up in rainbow colors. Oddly enough, this is Pride Month. And I think it just the straw that broke the camel's back. And so a lot of them just quietly went to the ballot box on, back in November of 2016 and voted for Trump. But the problem is you had a lot of evangelical elites, and Russell Moore was one of these. I'll tell you who he is. He got on CNN along with Albert Mohler. These are sort of the puritanical, element, which that's a whole other thing we can talk about. Some Puritans are good to read, and some Puritans are awesome. Other Puritans, like Richard Baxter, are not so much. And a lot of the more sanctimonious, like, never Trumper, leaders within the SBC, like Dr. Mueller, and which he sort of reversed his opinion, but I don't think he's actually reversed his opinion. And Dr. Russell Moore, they're the sort of approved opposition, shall we speak. And, they come from this sort of genteel, Southern Cavalier kind of background who, likes being able to go to the same drinking parties and the same, social gatherings as, the big media types or the big business types. And, they want to have influence in the culture, you see. Russell Moore likes to be able to go and write op-eds for the New York Times and be invited onto CNN. And
he wants to schmooze with all the beautiful people.
Yes, exactly. And so the evangelical leaders did not like that very much. They did not like the fact that 81% of evangelicals voted for an adulterer and a casino owner. But it's like, look, that adulterer and that casino owner did more to confront the issues that have been eroding evangelical influence within the culture and the Christian character of the nation over the past 40 years than you guys have done in all of that time. Trump has actually done some things about that. And it just aggravates these people. It infuriates them to no end. When Donald Trump showed up at David Platt's church, David Platt is another one of these Gospel Coalition guys. The sort of crying, sanctimonious evangelical who, in some of them, I think they have good intentions. They have, their heart might be in a quote unquote right place, but just the way they're going about it's just, they're inconsistent. So Russell Moore, is the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. But he's got sort of a shady past. He was born in Deep South Mississippi. And if you go to his Twitter timeline today, Matt, you want to take a guess as to what he's posting about on Twitter?
Black Lives Matter, I'm guessing.
Well, the Mississippi State House and State Senate voted, I think, yesterday to take the Confederate battle flag off of the state flag.
Well, close enough.
Yeah, so you're right there. Basically, like, this guy he was a back during the Nixon years. You had the shift from Southerners from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And a lot of that was, sort of post-civil rights movement. A lot of white Southerners saw that the Democratic Party had left them and left their interests, for better or for worse. And so they began voting Republican because of Nixon. Russell Moore is one of those guys who stayed within the Democratic Party. This guy was a Democrat operative in Mississippi, a totally political animal, who has sort of, shall we say, weaseled his way into power. Think Grima Wormtongue from the Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. That's Russell Moore.
Yeah.
He is... It's hard to describe exactly what he's been doing with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, but I'll give you an example. He's a guy who is saying that at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we should close down our churches to show love of neighbor, because we wouldn't want to give coronavirus to our neighbors. If we have a mass assembly of people to, do things like take communion, baptize people, all the functions that the historic church has done, even during times of plague. He's like, we're going to show how unloving we are. So we should just follow, the governor's orders. We should just follow the lockdown orders, because to not do so means that you don't love your neighbor. And loving your neighbor is, the second greatest commandment after loving God. He's the kind of guy who will get up there and he'll do a lot of bait and switch kind of games. When there was back at 2016, at the 2016 Southern Baptist Convention, there was a guy who got up and was like, why are we advocating for religious liberty for Muslims? Like, they already have people advocating for them. Why are we as the Southern Baptist Convention advocating? Because he's like, well, if we don't advocate for religious liberty for Muslims, then, the government's going to come after Southern Baptists. And he's like, okay, but the government's already doing that for them. Like, I don't think we have to worry about mosques being closed down in the United States. He's essentially is gaslighting the SBC. He tries to tell you things that are actually happening or not actually happening, like, the fact that he is using critical race theory and intersectionality to advocate for certain positions, while at the same time shaming people for, going against federal government mandates. So he is, a total political animal. John Harris, I point you to him. He has a lot of videos on Russell Moore and his shady past and shady history. But he's essentially a plant, in my opinion. He's a guy who never really gave up being part of the Democratic Party in his soul, and is trying to cause as much damage as he can within the Southern Baptist Convention. I think the man is a veritable Judas. Once again, my opinion, but John and his group, they're coming out with a video or a movie called Enemies Within the Church, and Russell Moore is one of the featured guys there. But, they had another instance of Russell Moore. There was a Tennessee Baptist State Convention was pushing to outlaw abortion in the state of Tennessee. They were trying to get help, because that's what the ERLC's job is. It's supposed to be like the socio-cultural, political, advocacy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, advocating for issues like religious liberty, religious freedom, the rights of the unborn, the traditional family. That's what it's supposed to do. And so you had pastors from the Tennessee State Baptist Convention who were pushing a bill on Nashville. They actually got politicians to listen to them, and I think it passed the Tennessee State House. And they were fighting and waging this on-the-ground campaign against Planned Parenthood and against, the pro-abortion forces in the state of Tennessee. And the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, along with the SBC headquarters, are in Nashville, the state capital of Tennessee. They weren't there. They were nowhere to be seen. Russell Moore mentioned nothing about this. He did nothing to help them fight this particular political battle. And it's like, Russell Moore, that's what your job is. You're supposed to advocate on these issues, and the entities are supposed to help the local churches be able to have an impact on the national level. And yet you had common, poor, everyday Christians, SBC pastors and laymen who were, writing their state representatives, who were, going door to door, who were, they actually got people on board to write a bill and to advocate for that in the Tennessee state legislature, and the ERLC was nowhere to be found. Russell Moore would rather be down there, protesting the death of Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd and talking about systemic racism than he would about, the erosion of our rights in the Bostic decision that just came down, the gay marriage issue, where our Christian employers going to be on the hook for anti-discrimination policies because of the fact that we have confessions of faith that says marriage is between a man and a woman, and we as a Christian college, you have to sign a statement of faith in order to work at that Christian college. And so are we now going to be sued by the gay lobby to pressure us into violating our conscience and what we believe is biblical fidelity to the gospel? So that's basically what Russell Moore is doing, is he's advocating for all of these left-wing social causes, redefine
and not doing anything with actual causes that Baptists would want to have to theologically get behind.
Exactly. Pro-life, they use the statements like, well, you're only pro-life so long as the baby is in the womb. You need to be pro-life when somebody is outside the womb, which means that you need to advocate for socialism and for reparations and for redistribution of wealth and, for those sorts of things. But then when we say, okay, well, we'll support school choice, charter schools and homeschooling, well, silence, And so that's why I think that the ERLC is, and John talks about this, that they've essentially been infiltrated, and they've become a wing of the Democratic Party within the Southern Baptist Convention. And that the big thing right now, because this is all about the election to them, the Democrats don't care about any of these, religious or social issues. For them, it's all about power. And what they are trying to do within the Southern Baptist Convention right now is they are trying to erode Trump's evangelical base to either demoralize them or even in the younger generation change their minds on these things, where it's like, well, this politician may advocate for, crushing socialist policies and for, the murder of the unborn, but he believes in racial justice, and that's a more pressing issue, so I have to vote for the Democrat over the Republican. So that's essentially what Russell Moore is doing at the denominational level. And he's gaslighting the conservatives, with one hand, saying, oh, no, we're not doing this at all, whereas, behind the scenes, this is what he's doing.
So like a total infiltrator, total snake.
Yes, a snake is a good word to describe him. I even heard somebody, a friend of mine who is at church, met him at a conference, and he's like, he told him one thing and then completely told him something that was completely contradictory and walked off. And this guy was like, wait a second, those two things don't coexist. What a snake. And so that's who Russell Moore is. if you want more information, you can check out the Conversations That Matter YouTube channel. John's got lots of videos going into Russell Moore and more specifics of the detail. That's essentially who he is. As far as some of the other big players, so maybe I'll back up. This is the time to talk about MLK 50. The MLK 50 conference took place in April of 2018, and this is when I noticed even somebody within my own church this is a guy who helped get me through a very difficult time in my personal life, and he was a Reformed Calvinist guy, and this was when I was in another city that was also near a Southern Baptist seminary, and that was a primarily Arminian seminary, and we were like two of the only Reformed guys going to one of the only Reformed-leaning Southern Baptist churches in that city. And, this guy was my friend, had me over at his house, and I started talking about some of these issues. I was like, man, like the Black Lives Matter movement is just a horrible movement. Like this is an anti-Christian, bigoted, hateful movement. I don't see how anybody can support it. And he just looked at me like, what are you talking about? There are so many issues of racial injustice in this country, and just look at police brutality and inequality and all the effects of slavery that are happening on the Black community to this day. And I was like, what are you talking about? All those effects are it's typically assumed in conservative circles that those were the effects of the Great Society. Among other issues that we can't go into on this channel. But I was like, Corey, what are you talking about? Like, are you hearing yourself talk? You're basically spouting the same talking points that Barack Obama would spout. And it was like, there's this complete disconnect. I was like, where is this coming from? And then the MLK 50 conference happened. This was a conference that happened in Memphis 2 years ago, April of 2018, to essentially commemorate the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis. And so Russell Moore was the keynote speaker. There were a number of other pastors, big name guys within evangelicalism, guys like Matt Chandler, guys like John Piper, David Platt, mainly the SBC, a little bit PCA, as well as, even Anglican Church of North America, some of the other evangelical denominations. And obviously John Piper is a big guy within evangelicalism. Basically talking about, repenting of like white privilege and, buying into all of these categories of critical race theory and intersectionality, and, how we as the white evangelical church need to strive for multi-ethnic, racial church. We want the church on earth to look like the church in heaven is their biggest phrase, which it sounds good on the surface, but then when you actually dig into the details, it's like, well, what if people just like to worship around people who have the same language and the same likes of food and clothing? If you're in a country white church where the neighborhood is 95% white, why do you need to have a bunch of people who are not from that town, come to your church? That they're not being sinful. They're just ministering to the neighborhood they're in. In neighborhoods where there are multi-ethnic communities, it's like, well, maybe the Korean community in our community likes to worship at the Korean Baptist church. Is there anything wrong with that intrinsically? So long as they're not saying that nobody else can come, it's like, not really. So they're making a mountain out of a molehill, and talking about issues of police brutality and that kind of stuff, and how we need to repent of the sins of the white church, and that kind of stuff. And a couple months later, John MacArthur's group. So these are the battle lines that are being drawn up for your knowledge, Matt, as well as for the viewers. John MacArthur was sort of leading the opposition to this within evangelicalism. They came out with something called the Dallas Statement on Social Justice, which essentially was condemning the social justice movement, saying that it's an anti-Christian, neo-Marxist movement, acknowledging people's equality before God, acknowledging that all men are created, with a moral inherent value created in the image of God, that all men, we need to preach to every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, and that every tribe, tongue, people, and nation is going to be before the throne of God in heaven. But that the critical race theory, intersectionality categories that are being used by social justice evangelicals are heretical, and that they need to be called out. And so it became a divisive political issue that exploded about a year later in March of 2019 at the Shepherd's Conference at MacArthur's church, where Phil Johnson, who is one of John MacArthur's right-hand man, and I'm not sure how much you know about John MacArthur, but he was Larry King's token evangelical who would come on, and he is as conservative, Bible-believing as the day is long. But oddly enough, he's out in Los Angeles. His church is more multi-ethnic than many of the woke social justice SBC guys. And two of the guys at his church, Virgil Walker and Daryl Harrison, who have the Just Thinking podcast, are two black guys who speak out against the evangelical social justice movement in their podcast and say this is heretical. And so MacArthur came out on his side, guys who sort of lined up with him, Douglas Wilson, who's a Presbyterian guy up in Idaho, and his sort of group, James White down in Phoenix is another Reformed apologist, Jeff Durbin, his fellow pastor. So these are some of the big names on the anti-social justice side who came out with the Dallas Statement. And it's become a very contentious issue within evangelicalism because Johnson, so at that Shepherd's Conference, you had MacArthur and Phil Johnson on one side, and there was some other guy in the middle. And then you had Albert Mohler, Mark Dever, and I think Ligon Duncan on the other side. Albert Mohler and Mark Dever being two very big names within the Southern Baptist Convention, and Ligon Duncan being the president of Reformed Theological Seminary, which is the seminary affiliated with the Presbyterian Church in America, which is the conservative Presbyterian denomination. And Phil Johnson basically just came out and he's like, Al, you talk a lot about gay marriage and homosexuality and abortion and that kind of stuff on your daily podcast. Why are you guys not speaking out against, critical race theory and intersectionality and social justice movement? And Dr. Mohler just wasn't having any of that. He went back against Phil very hard in the other direction, and it got very awkward because John MacArthur and John MacArthur and Albert Mohler are very good friends, and they were celebrating John MacArthur's 50th year of ministry that year. And here at the keynote roundtable at the end of the conference, where everybody's expecting this nice, cordial conversation, it got really ugly very quickly. And so there is a split within evangelicalism right now. And I'll put it to you this way. There's people who are trying to advocate a quote unquote third way, sort of like the third way in politics, where it's like, oh, well, we can acknowledge good on this issue that these guys say, and then good, on this other issue that these guys say, but, we need to find a new way. We don't need to be involved in partisan politics and that kind of stuff, which is like, okay, that sounds good, but it's really just a cover for the left. It's a cover for the people who are buying into the social justice movement. Danny Akin himself, who is the president of Southeastern Seminary, that's Pastor Tom's alma mater when it comes to theological seminaries, which I hope that's not too bad for Pastor Tom. But he was being criticized by guys like James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian, who were analyzing his video, and where Danny Akin was doing a Q&A on these issues, and Akin is going woke. He basically said that, well, if you want to know what I believe, I believe the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, and these are the same kinds of people, let me back up, Matt. These are the same kinds of people who would say, well, we don't sign statements. We just don't do statements. we just believe the Bible. We just hold to the confession of faith, the abstractive principles that we have in our seminaries and the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. And, but we don't sign these controversial statements. But here's Danny Akin going on, and he's like, I believe the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. I believe the Chicago statement on inerrancy. I believe the Nashville statement on, homosexuality and gay marriage. And I believe the Danvers statement on, biblical manhood and womanhood. And he starts listing off all of these well-known evangelical statements that Big Eva, that's another term, has put out there. And yet there was one statement that was conspicuously missing from his list, and that was the Dallas statement on social justice. If you sign as a seminary professor, and John Harris just did an interview with Russell Fuller, who is a seminary professor at Southern Seminary up in Louisville, that's Albert Mohler's seminary. If you sign the Dallas statement as a Southern Baptist seminary professor or someone who works for a Southern Baptist entity, you are risking your job. It's gotten that deep within the convention, and that's the battle lines that are being drawn. Dr. Fuller was fired from Southern Seminary, along with every other person who signed the Dallas statement at Southern Seminary, every person who's opposed Dr. Mohler appointing social justice seminary professors like Jarvis Williams. I know these are names I'm throwing out and you don't know who they are, but if you look into these guys, Matthew Hall, who, is the head of Boyce College, which is the undergraduate wing of Southern Seminary, who did this interview that went viral where he said, well, I'm a racist. And this is a white guy, and he's not saying that in the sense that he supports Jim Crow. He's saying that he's a racist in the critical theory, social justice, intersectionality that, I was born with white privilege and I'm part of an oppressive white culture. And, I have to repent every day, and racism is a sin I'm going to struggle with for the rest of my life because I'm part of this oppressive, white culture that, needs to repent. These are the kinds of guys that are now teaching in the seminaries, and guys like Dr. Fuller and sort of the old time conservatives who were there for the conservative resurgence are being pushed out. Paige Patterson, for instance, got caught up in the Me Too movement. It's not anything that he did, but it was some allegation. And I don't know what the legal system shows. I don't think there was much that came of the allegations. I'm not going to speculate on any of that kind of stuff, but because of his support for somebody who I think ended up in court, he kept a guy on. Paige Patterson was let go from Southwestern Seminary. And I'm not very, just as an aside in this regard for people who are out there who know the issues, I'm not a fan of Paige Patterson in a lot of ways, and he may have definitely done something wrong, but the reasons for which he was fired.
The point, yeah, he wasn't fired for the sins he actually committed. It was just an excuse.
Yeah, exactly. They're trying to rename all the buildings at a lot of the seminaries now, and J.D. Greer, who's the president, who's at the Summit Church in Raleigh-Durham, it's the largest mission-sending Southern Baptist church in the country. This guy was supposed to be elected. He was elected 2 years ago as SBC president. SBC president served 2-year terms. He was supposed to be the new fresh face. He's a guy sort of his mid to late 40s, so he's relatively younger guy, and wearing the skinny jeans and that kind of stuff, but still supposedly being biblically faithful. This guy, all you have to do is look at his support for guys like Dhati Lewis and, the Resolution 9, which that's a whole other thing, where the Southern Baptist Convention essentially endorsed critical race theory and intersectionality as analytical tools, which is a denial of sola scriptura and a denial of the sufficiency of the Bible, which is a denial of our confession of faith. They ramrodded Resolution 9 through the committee in 2019. J.D. Greer is as woke can be. He's the guy that came out and virally said, we as white Christians need to say Black Lives Matter And he said it in that very, guttural sound. And he's like, the movement has the Black Lives Matter organization has hijacked, the statement Black Lives Matter in the movement, but we need to get ahead of this and, come out and give the, as Christians say Black Lives Matter. And it's like, well, first of all, JD, yeah, of course Black Lives matter as a tautology because Black lives are made in the image of God, but they don't matter any more than white lives or Asian lives or Hispanic lives or anyone else who's created in God's image. And the Black Lives Matter organization did not hijack this movement. They founded this movement. And that's the problem with the Resolution 9 that I mentioned that was passed last year, where they say, people have appropriated, critical race theory and intersectionality, for bad purposes. And it's like, no, they didn't appropriate these tools. They created these tools. The origins of critical race theory and intersectionality are in neo-Marxism. Just read James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree. This is a guy who is coming from those oppressed, power dynamics that you can't be racist unless unless you're in an oppressed minority and, you cannot be racist if you're in the quote unquote oppressed class, that only oppressors can be racist, which this is a neo-Marxist idea. That comes out of that, as that line of thinking and that tradition.
Yeah, racism is prejudice plus power.
Yes, exactly. And so that's what's being advocated now. And so we have here's the state of the SBC at this point, Matt, just brass tacks and why this matters. We have a woke SBC president. All of our seminary heads are woke. Our big leaders, the big pastors who are out in the culture, David Platt, Matt Chandler, Thabiti Anyabwile, they're all woke. And so right now what we have is we're in a very similar situation, a very precarious situation that is very similar to where we were at before the conservative resurgence in the 1970s, where you have a lot of country churches, a lot of small churches, a lot of people out in the hinterlands and the heartlands of America who live in the Midwest or the Deep South, in these working class communities, churches that are made up of primarily working class white, people who are just, your salt of the earth, good-hearted, like, yeah, we want to support foreign missions. We want to see people in the inner city come to Christ, but that's sort of where the people as a whole are at. Like Beckloff likes to say, it's like, yeah, a lot of these leaders are, a bad position, but the common churchgoer doesn't believe all this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, that's true. But eventually, particularly with the younger generation, James White from Alpha and Omega Ministries, he's a Reformed Baptist guy. He's been interacting with this issue for a number of years now. He's having these woke young evangelical seminary graduates who are coming at him, with these same categories and, these same arguments. And Dr. White is like, where are these people coming from? Is this what is being taught in the seminaries, in Southern Baptist seminaries now? And so, while yes, the common average working class person, who are out in the hinterland are, they're still conservative. They don't believe this stuff. The people in the suburbs, the people in the inner cities, and most importantly, the young pastors, future pastors who are going to these seminaries are being turned into woke preachers. That's why when James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian, who are agnostics. I mean, James Lindsay's a former Sam Harris, wing atheist. He was a former New Atheist guy. They're being interviewed, and he's like, if I wanted to destroy the Christian church, if I was back in my, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, New Atheist days, he's like, what would be my strategy of going out to do that? And he's like, I'd make all the pastors woke. And here's a guy who's not a Christian, who doesn't have the truth of the gospel, who sees these issues far more clearly than our own leadership. And that's where we stand at this point. the SBC it's in trouble. It's in a bad way, and it may not manifest itself a year from now. It may not manifest itself 5 years from now. But give this erosion a generation, and the SBC is going to look just like the Episcopal Church. It's going to look just like the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. It's going to look exactly like the United Church of Christ. It's going to look like all the state Northern Baptist denominations. It's just going to become another, dead liberal Christian denomination with, that is dying and that has no power or effect for the gospel. So that's where we stand. And so I tell all the viewers out there, if you don't think this, can't come for you and your organizations or your churches, be warned, be preparing now, how you're going to respond to these issues. And so is there hope? I think there is. I think that that same younger generation is producing guys like John Harris. It may not be within the Southern Baptist Convention. The organization, the institution itself may be too far gone. But as far as evangelicalism as a whole, as far as what we would believe, our Bible-believing, gospel-believing, gospel-preaching churches, that there is hope. That anytime there is an apostasy, a lot of time, this all goes back to our understanding of Christian theology, our understanding of the nature of the church, that ultimately we know that Christ will triumph. And that we know the end of the story, that one day the Lord will return and he will rule and reign. And if his kingdom, as the Apostles' Creed says, there will be no end. But the issue is more on a local level, both geographically and historically, is how will our generation be seen? How will our generation of Christians be judged by the Lord? How will we stand before him, on the day of judgment and give an account for what we did to ensure the spread of the gospel? Because ultimately, here's the issue, Matt. Why is this a heresy? What is wrong with this movement? How does this contradict Scripture? I was in church this morning, and our pastor was preaching from 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. And let me pull it up real quick. And it's a beautiful verse. And it talks about, what Christ did for us. And it says, I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible, for Christ also died, or the Greek word there is pascho or epiphane, which is suffered, but suffering unto death is the implication. So he suffered unto death for sins once for all. And that once is not a reference like once for all people. It's a temporal term. It's once for all time. That he only had to die once. And it says, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God. That's the ultimate reason why Jesus came into the world, is to reconcile the elect, to reconcile God's people to himself. It's as simple as that. What is the point of justification, glorification, the resurrection, all of these great and glorious truths that are associated with the gospel? It's that we might have fellowship with God again. And not that he would take us back to the state that we had in the garden before the fall, but that in Christ, the Christian has something better, far better than Adam ever had before the fall. That there is a sweetness, as the Westminster Confession of Faith talks about, what is the chief end of man? That he glorify God and enjoy him forever. It says, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. And the Christian gospel teaches a once-for-all finished sacrifice of Christ. this is, goes back to the issues of the Reformation and why, I'm Reformed, and why as a Calvinist, I think this is the only consistent apologetic for Protestants against the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church, is that unlike the Mass, which is seen as a propitiatory sacrifice within Rome's system, or the Eucharist still having, I'm less familiar with Orthodox theology, so the Eastern Orthodox listener can forgive me for some of the details, but there is a sense in which the sacraments communicate God's grace that we believe, no, Christ's death in and of itself accomplished what God was intending to accomplish, and that God and God alone brings man unto himself for salvation, and that God does this perfectly. Because that was the whole problem with the Jewish sacrificial system, is that the sacrifices had to keep being repeated because it didn't actually perfect those for whom it was made. They were mere shadows pointing to the greater reality, the perfect sacrifice of Christ that actually takes away sin, that actually takes away guilt once for all time. And so there is no inherited guilt. And so that's the problem with the woke movement, is it says there are things that Christ's sacrifice cannot forgive, such as white privilege. It is a denial of original sin, saying that some men can commit these sins, but other men cannot. And it is a denial of the sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice to bring actual reconciliation between God and his people, and between the people and each other. And so that is why I would say the woke movement within evangelicalism is a heresy. It's a damnable heresy. And if people believe it consistently, there's a lot of people who are inconsistent in their beliefs. And we understand, from our perspective, so long as we live in these mortal bodies that are still tainted with sin, we're all going to have blind spots. We're all going to have besetting sins. That's the hope of the resurrection. That's the hope of glorification on the last day, that we will be given new bodies, that corresponds to our new heart and our new nature, where there is no more hint or taint of sin. But in this life, there is going to be inconsistency, and we're all going to struggle with sin. But the woke movement denies this verse. It denies this teaching that is fundamental to the Christian faith and to the Christian gospel. And that's the battle we're fighting right now. We are fighting a battle over the fallenness of man, his need for redemption, and the means of his redemption. And what is more cruel about the woke movement, even than the medieval concept of indulgences, is that eventually you can be forgiven and achieve the expiation of the temporal punishments of, your venial sins. The woke movement,
God forgives. Wokeness doesn't.
Yes. It's you have to perpetually bow the knee. You have to do perpetual repentance, of which there is no forgiveness. There is no absolution. And it's a perpetual treadmill of bowing the knee, penance. Far worse, in my opinion. The implications are far worse even than indulgences, as they were practiced by the late medieval church. So that's where we find ourselves. So yeah, man, that's the basic overview. I'm sort of out of monologuing ability at this point, but if you have any more questions you wanted to talk about more specifics, we can certainly do that.
Well, I mean, you kind of overviewed it very well for me, because my big question here, before you more or less answered it, was how this infiltration kind of happened. I mean, you mentioned earlier that mainline Protestant sects were infiltrated and subverted a lot faster because they had a top-down hierarchy. I don't know if you recall last year when Beckloff did a series of shows about Harvest Bible Church and what's his face, James McDonald. I think when I was asked about this on one of his shows, kind of the answer I gave was that my perspective on it was that a top-down denominational structure really doesn't work for a Protestant or a Baptist organization, just because there's no accountability. I mean, in the Catholic Church, if you're going to imitate a Catholic Church hierarchy, in theory, obviously the system is being massively abused now.
Sure.
There's a system of checks and balances to prevent any one priest or any one bishop from getting out of line. There is in theory accountability, whereas with something like Harvest Bible Church, there's no one like who watches the Watchers. Who watches James McDonald? He probably gives some kind of answer like, "Well, God watches me," but that's that. I don't think that's sufficient for an organization, particularly given what he was doing. So my perspective on it was that the advantage of a Protestant church is this decentralization. The primacy of the local church, the autonomy of the local church. But from what it looks like, it was just the subversion process here with the Southern Baptist Convention was just a longer measure of what basically happened to society at large. The long march of the institutions.
Yes, exactly. The long march through the institutions. And I agree to your point about Roman Catholicism, and theoretically, at least, liberation theology has obviously come to the Catholic Church as well. Look no further than Francis. Theoretically, you have a tradition. You can go back to the year 1000 and see what the Pope taught. You can't do that with a Harvest Bible Church. That theoretically, the Pope is bound by tradition. Theoretically, you have a magisterium where he is in, council with the cardinals and the archbishops of the Catholic Church, and so he's not acting alone. And so there is theoretically accountability. Now, we would say Declaration of Papal Infallibility in 1870. And the Orthodox would also say that. It's like, well, when Leo the Ninth or whoever it was, Pius the Ninth, came out and said, "I am tradition," that is overthrowing the historic nature of what Catholicism itself taught. But that's an issue for another day. But yeah, that's the problem when you have evangelical denominations that become top down, is it really does become this sort of old boys club. And, while that can serve conservative interest at times, if that is merely inherited by tradition without those men holding to the convictions upon which the denomination was founded, you're going to have a bunch of little popes like J.D. Greer, with his 15 campus, church where he's the pastor that, preaches through the video screen, and, people at all these satellite locations are hearing his opinion. And it's like, that's not a pastor. He can't pastor the people in all of those different locations. He doesn't even know them.
I would think that a pastor, or a priest, or anyone who's shepherding a church should be in the church and should know everyone in it. Maybe not be friends with everyone, but he should know everyone to be able to guide them. You can't do that over a telelink. Yes,
exactly. And I mean, you see that issue with Joel Osteen and the bigger, sort of prosperity guys who they like to criticize. Maybe MacArthur's church is an exception to this. They are a mega church, but they essentially, have Bible study groups where the men who lead those Bible study groups are assistant pastors. And it's like, okay, well, maybe they are, still being ministered. But in that case, it's like, well, that's really more of a bunch of little churches than one big church. But yeah, that is one of the problems, is when you have Protestants try to essentially form this Episcopal and low church Protestants. I have Anglican and Lutheran friends who would yell at me right now. But low church Protestants, which that's what evangelicals are, is low church Protestants. When we try to do that, it just doesn't work well. And it only, I think, makes for the entrenchment of bad teaching, as opposed to protecting the flock from bad teaching. Because when the pastor himself becomes a heretic and you have this top-down structure, the church is in bad straits at that point. So I guess the last thing, sort of talk about before we exit out of the stream is I have no idea how this is going to affect the 2020 election. The church, particularly the evangelical denominations, the Southern Baptist Convention, the PCA, we are not as strong as we were 4 years ago. I'm concerned that there's a lot of people who are going to end up voting for Joe Biden because Orange Man racist, because of George Floyd, because, BLM, because of that kind of stuff. And it's like, look, I have a lot of criticisms for Trump, but I would say they would be valid criticisms, but guys like Russell Moore, and they're telling the pastors, Albert Mohler came out and said he's going to vote for Trump in the 2020 election. But Russell Moore, those other entity heads, they are staying silent, and they're not going to tell their people to go out and support the Republican candidate. They're even now saying, well, it's okay to vote Democrat. And it's like, oh yeah, the party that took God out of the platform and that enshrines the murder of the unborn. Just because you think they have, better social policy when it comes to redistribution of wealth, which we know is a disaster as well, that it's okay to vote for them. So as far as, what I'm looking at doing at this point, I'm in Southern Baptist Church right now. I love my pastors. I love the people who are there, but they're trying to take this third way. And that's not sustainable long term. A decision's going to have to be made at some point. And, I'm just saying that I'm evaluating my options, particularly as I have other people in my life now who I have to look out for their spiritual well-being. I'm keeping my eyes wide open and evaluating all of my options.
Sorry to hear that.
So, well, Matt, do you have anything else you wanted to say today?
Not really. Like I said, the main question I had, you basically already answered it. What do you see basically as the most likely future of all this? I mean, the way you've talked about it, you've implied that the Southern Baptist Convention is probably going to head for a major split.
Yes.
Do you think the best way to deal with this would be like to return to that local kind of autonomous model, where there's no real, overarching structure? It's far more difficult, I would think, to subvert a bunch of local churches than a hierarchical structure, as you said.
Yeah. So there's a couple of issues here, and this is a very good point. I think this is definitely a good place to sort of round things out. One of the geniuses of the original Southern Baptist Convention, and this comes back to the biblical principle that we see in the Apostle Paul's life, where there was a famine in the church in Jerusalem. And so the church in Jerusalem was suffering both famine and persecution simultaneously. It was not a good situation. And so the Apostle Paul, when he was planting churches up in Asia Minor and in Greece, he was eliciting funds, donations from the churches in Greece and Asia Minor to support the saints in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria, who were undergoing intense persecution as well as extreme economic hardship. And so the Macedonian church in particular, the church of Philippi and the church of Thessalonica, which are the two major Macedonian cities, they gave from their own lack of resources to support another struggling, hurting part of the church that was in even worse straits than they were. And so there is this understanding that even though there is autonomy, quote unquote, of the local church, that there is a Catholicity to the local church or to the Christian church as a whole. That, while we would not, endorse the sort of visible Catholic Church in the way in which it has become now, we do recognize there is a Catholicity to the local church or to the Christian church that goes beyond the local churches. And the reason I say that is that was the purpose of the cooperative program within the Southern Baptist Convention, where we would all donate as local churches to sort of one big pot. And that's how we could, fund seminary education. That's how we could especially fund missionaries and church planning. I heard stories about missionaries who were in, closed access countries, communist countries, Muslim countries, where there was a safe house that was provided for by the cooperative program, that if a single local church had been trying to support that missionary, those kinds of resources would not have existed. There was even like a network to get them out of the country because of persecution that had been breaking out in a local area. And it's like, that's the beauty of churches cooperating together with one another, is that you can do more in that regard. So that would be the tragedy if the Southern Baptist Convention goes for a split. That being said, truth is worth pain. Fidelity to truth and love, because we love we talk about love of neighbor. There's a lot of discussion about love of neighbor, organizations like the Gospel Coalition, which, big evangelicalism, that's sort of the network of Southern Baptist and PCA and Anglican Church in North America and all the other evangelical groups. They have their, big speakers and put on their conferences, and they sort of network amongst each other. They've gone completely woke. I've heard someone call them the Social Gospel Coalition. They put a hammer and sickle as a parody in the logo. But I think that love of God comes even before love of neighbor. Love of God and his truth. Fidelity to Christ before fidelity. Sometimes we have to say hard words to fellow Christians. We have to say, look, man, there's this thing in your life that's not right now, and you need to get right with God, and I'm going to hold you accountable to that. And if they don't ever get right, there's disfellowshipping, there's excommunication, there's a process of church discipline that needs to happen. And so I think that's what needs to happen right now with the SBC and with evangelicalism as a whole, is that us who are on the shore, holding out the lifeline to those who are drowning in wokeness, we need to stand upon the rock that is Christ first and foremost, and call them to repentance, call them to biblical faithfulness. And if they don't, I don't think there's necessarily a hard and fast rule as to how long we should do that, but I think it will become apparent when that split needs to happen. And there are already institutions being put in place. The Conservative Baptist Network was launched last year by a number of conservative Southern Baptist churches. That's essentially a network of, they don't say this, but anti-woke churches within the Southern Baptist Convention. There are, I think, partnerships that we can have with people even outside of the convention. I mentioned Doug Wilson and his group, which they're part of the Christian Reformed Evangelical Church. We may not unite with them as a denomination, but sort of have mutual fellowship with them, recognizing that, yes, even though they do infant baptism and we do believers baptism, that we believe the same gospel and hold to the same truth. And so I think there will be new alliances that form. But I think that while a return to having more autonomy of the local church is a good thing, that it's going to come at a great cost. And it's not that that cost is not worth paying, but we have to be willing to sacrifice to make that payment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you're gonna have to give up a lot of comfort, but the reward will be, staying true to the spirit of God and the Bible.
Yeah. The Lord took 12 illiterate fishermen and turned the world upside down. And after the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, which is funny, my Eastern Orthodox friend was telling me today is the feast day of Peter and Paul, that's commemorating their martyrdom at the hands of the Emperor Nero, that from their martyrdom to the peace of the church in 312, when Constantine signed the Edict of Milan, or issued the Edict of Milan, the Christian church for 250 years was a minority, persecuted, countercultural, illegal religion that survived for 250 years under those conditions. And not only survived, but thrived. And why was that? Because the message of the Christian gospel, the truth that it contains, changed the hearts and minds of people within the Roman Empire, the slaves, the women, the common people, even those within the aristocracy who saw the bankrupt nature of the Greco-Roman religious system, that Richard Spencer likes to, LARP as, saying that he had his Greco-Roman phase, that it was the Christian religion that made Rome and Europe what it was. And it was the Christian religion that overthrew that tyrannical system that the Roman imperial state had instituted. And these were people without money, without power, without resources, were persecuted, and they endured it for 250 years. And if they can do that under the conditions that they did, plagues and, all sorts of terrible things that we just can't even fathom today. I think of St. Cyprian's letter to the Christians in the mines, Christians who had been taken as slaves by the Roman state for refusing to renounce Christ, to work in mines in the deserts of North Africa. Something, far worse than whatever happened in the antebellum South. When he's writing to them, comforting them, pointing them to the hope that they have in Christ and the gospel and the resurrection, the coming kingdom, that that their Lord would conquer, not through the sword or through the, the means of revolution that men would go through, but that through the conversion of hearts. One day Christ is coming back with a sword, but in this age, there's a conquest through conversion that, those people endured, and they gave us the heritage that we have today. And this comes back to my Calvinistic understanding of the faith that, God is God. He has seen the end from the beginning, that he knows who his elect are, and he is going to win them regardless of man's interference, and that we have a great hope, and that regardless of how things turn out with the Southern Baptist Convention, that ultimately Christ's church will break down the gates of Hades, and Christ will have the ultimate victory.
Oh, yeah. Remember, he has already won.
Yes. Yep. That's seen later in 1 Peter, actually, where it talks about him proclaiming his victory over, the fallen angels, and that, already he has accomplished what he is going to accomplish. It's just a matter of seeing the realization of that in time. So we're about 2 hours in, Matt. Did you have any final words that you wanted to say? Any final thoughts?
Nothing's coming to mind, but we could always do another stream where we go over other related topics.
Sure, I'd love to talk about some of these issues with Beckloft and Pastor Tom, and it's just such an honor to have you on as my first guest on a live stream. And I actually have a buddy of mine. We were knocked around the idea of starting sort of a duo. He's another Southern Baptist guy who's kind of like me. He grew up in the South. Of course, he grew up in the state across the Savannah River, as we like to say in Georgia. He's a South Carolinian. We have been talking about a lot of these issues. And there are a lot of younger guys, a lot of men who, my age and younger who, are starting to see these issues for what they are. And, so there is hope in that regard. But, I've been following you guys for a long time, and just so thankful for your works over the years, and wouldn't be where I'm at today if it wasn't for y'all's commentary, going all the way back to the early 2000s, and just seeing the change that's happened in the culture, and seeing imperfectly, though it may be, y'all's faithfulness in trying to get the truth out there on a number of issues. And, your work is encouraging to a lot of people that you may not know about.
Yeah, I appreciate hearing that, because it does get annoying and difficult in the position, but it is nice to know that people are getting value from the stuff I'm doing.
Cool. Well, Matt, I guess we'll end the stream here. Do you want to give like a plug for your channel before we go?
Yeah, I can't imagine people who are watching this don't know who I am, but you can always go to mattforney.com. Like, that's where all my stuff is centralized. My YouTube is youtube.com/user/realmattforney. The only real social media I have under my real name these days is my Telegram, which is at t.me/mattforney. I don't know how much longer I'll have that, given that Telegram is suspect, but it's there for now if you want to follow it. I'd also encourage you to go check out my publishing company, Terror House Press. We put out a book just over a week ago that's probably of interest to the people watching. It's called Masculinity Amidst Madness by Ryan Landry. Kind of a book on how to survive in a chaotic world. Kind of cultivate yourself as a man. Get in touch with your cultural and religious roots and whatnot. And as a foreword by Bronze Age Pervert, if you've heard of Bronze Age mindsets, this book is basically the perfect companion volume, and it's been flying off the shelves. When we released it, it leapt up to #1 on Amazon, the best new releases in philosophy, beating Ben Shapiro's new book. So that was pretty nice. So you can get that. You can buy that at terrorhousepress.com if you don't want to use Amazon. You can find it on Amazon. Obviously, just search Masculinity Amidst Madness. It's also at Barnes & Noble and pretty much any other bookstore you can think of.
Awesome. Well, Matt, that ends it for my first live stream. This is the Event Horizon channel. I guess I'll come up with a pithy saying at some point, but for today, this will do. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Take care, folks.